Good morning, everybody. I am very, very excited to be here. And you know I'm excited because there's an exclamation point on the slide. I am excited not only to talk to you about the data realm in 2019, but I'm mostly really excited to be here with all of you, because this community has really been the most of my professional life. In fact, it's been all of my professional life. My whole professional life has been, while I've also done other things in the meantime and taken breaks, really the most of it has been Ember related. Basically, since I left college, I've been working with Ember things. And that's been basically due to no fault of my own. I had, I had no say in making this decision. Basically, I graduated, and I moved to Silicon Valley as a very young and underslept and energetic young graduate trying to make it in the world of tech. And I showed up to the first place I was going to work at, a company called Adapar. You might know them from a bunch of Ember libraries and also as sponsors of this conference. And I showed up on my first day of work, and I was kind of intimidated. And I started talking to my manager, who basically told me, OK, look, we have this Java Swing app. If you don't know what Java Swing is, I can just tell you it's so old, I couldn't find a logo that had a transparent background. So I basically was like, oh, no. But then my manager told me, don't worry. We're going to rewrite this in modern web technologies. I was like, oh, thank God. Otherwise, I thought I would have to email my parents and tell them that all the sacrifices they made for my education would be wasted on me making Java Swing UIs for the rest of my life. So I was excited. I was like, oh, cool. I know some JavaScript. I love the web. It's exciting. So let's do this. And then they showed me their tech stack. And I was like, OK, so we were using CoffeeScript. I was like, OK, that's nice. CoffeeScript seems pretty cool. We even had a build system, which back then was kind of impressive. It was made in Grunt.js. And we were using this thing called Ember. And basically, that was our stack. And I looked at it, and I was like, yeah, this Ember thing, I don't really, I've heard of the other libraries, and those seem fine. But this Ember thing, I'm not quite sure like how I feel about it. So as any young, arrogant tech grad, I spent basically about 20 minutes investigating this library before I crafted an opinion. This is like, I managed to contact Adapar and get archival footage of what actually happened. This was basically me. And after 20 minutes, I looked at Ember, and I was like, this seems kind of complicated. Why? Are you sure you want to use this? Do you not want to use something simpler and more understandable and more readable, like Backbone? And I had a very serious conversation with my manager about why are we using this complicated library. And thankfully, he basically paid no attention to what I said. Or, I mean, he paid attention and then immediately disregarded all my opinions that were basically made in about 20 minutes of basically looking at the code samples we had. So thankfully, ever since then, I've been working on Ember. We used Ember Data back when versions were in a JSON file, and they were going up to 18, and there was no Semver, and the Ember had a version of 0.9.8 with the old router API. I had really fun conversations about that over drinks a couple of days ago. So now I'm very fortunate. I currently work at LinkedIn. But basically, for the last 8 years, I've worked on Ember and Ember Data and Ember-related libraries, which is a very long time. And I think that is, especially if you compare it to a lot of other JavaScript libraries and a lot of these stacks that we have used in the last 8 years, is quite a long time. But on the other hand, I'm not quite sure that saying we are super old is a great argument in the tech ecosystem. If you're like trying to qualify for a museum grant or something, I think maybe then it works. Like I would, but then you have to like compete with the Egyptians and stuff, and that's kind of hard. So I don't think that basically saying that we are super old is a compelling argument. It's quite nice, and having developed these relationships in the community. So one of the things I want to address today is why are we still relevant? Like, why does any of this matter? Why are we here, other than to have a yearly gathering and see each other and have a good time at this amazing conference? So the thing I want to talk to you today about is what we learned, and where has that brought us, and how do we solve for tomorrow? How do we create our own future, and how do we make this library and our app successful? So I want to bring you back to the world in which Ember and Ember Data were created. That was back in 2011. It was so long ago that most of the people in this image were still alive. So I want to also give you context to what the JavaScript world was back then. Here are some of the active debates we had back then on Hacker News, back when it was still good, and in the blogosphere. It was, should you use a build system? It was, do we have to support IE6? It was, should apps require JavaScript at all? Or should you be able to have should you even just have HTML? And are single-page apps even a valuable concept? Or should we just continue server rendering apps on the back end? So these were some of the active controversies of the day back in 2011. On the other hand, this wasn't an active controversy. We all agreed it was round and spherical. But if you think about the world back then and compare it to the world today, we have amazing build systems. We have almost evergreen browsers. We have TypeScript, which is amazing. And single-page apps are basically a de facto way of making complicated web applications. It seems that in the last 7 or 8 years, we have made tremendous progress, and our ecosystem is much, much better and asks more of us. Really, the only thing that hasn't improved in the last 7 or 8 years has been my accent. But at least EmberConf now has captions, so that brings us somewhere. Last time I spoke here, we didn't have captions, so I just had to try harder. This is like easy mode. So given that we survived for so long and that we still thrive looking at this room here, I want to talk about why that is, except, well, the main reason is we have so many people here in the audience and out on the internet who work tremendously hard on making our life better and making this library a success. But I also feel that we made some bets that have worked out really well and that allow people to look at what we've done and decide to trust us and trust us to bet on our future and trust our judgment, more or less. I don't think you should trust mine. But there are many fine core team members here whose judgments I trust. So what are these key decisions that we made as part of the Ember and Ember Data ecosystem, basically? I think a couple of them have to do with separation of concerns. So we have early on isolated the model layer, which I think was a key. If you remember how apps looked back then, this was one of the key benefits to having a separated system that deals with the server-loaded data, but has no UI concerns on it, which took us a couple of years to have an add-on ecosystem that doesn't put most of the UI concerns in the model layer. But at this point, I think that allows for like a really easy separation of concerns and isolation of state. And also, you can automatically get a bunch of really nice features. You can like get state flags. You can get, you're able to interact with the model layer, and it's conventional. And also, it allows you to, even if you're not using Ember Data, if you're using other libraries, if you're using Orbit, or if you're still stuck on Ember model, you're able to use a very similar looking system. We've kind of standardized on at least your front-end model layer looks very similar. Most of the model classes have a save. Most have state flags. It's like really easy to. It makes migration between different libraries and experimentation much easier, which is a theme I'll repeatedly come back to. And the other thing we did is we also isolated model layer with a schema. And we put the schema in your code base. This was also not this was also pretty controversial, because most of the time you access backend data, you don't have a schema. And even sometimes if your backend is Mongo, you don't even have a backend schema. You just have data. And having the schema really has gotten us many wins. Has enabled us to conventionally serialize and normalize data, but has also had much wider repercussions in the ecosystem, because you can use tools like Mirage, where automatically, because you have a schema, Mirage knows how to set up your test backend and how to create a fake API based just on your schema. You don't have to configure anything. You just install Mirage, and you're basically good to go. And there are a bunch of other benefits to having a common schema format that we can use so that all the add-on the whole ecosystem and all the developers know how to format it and how to use it. And we also isolated the serialization and network layer, which I've had clients back when I was consulting that needed to move from things like Google Cloud APIs to Firebase because Google Cloud APIs were getting deprecated. And if they hadn't isolated their network and serialized the stack, this would have been much, much harder. But not only that, we are also able to have tools like Fastboot, for example, configures itself automatically when you install it to hook into your network layer. And this is only possible because we've isolated the network layer. And that has taken, it has been a very painful journey because normally, like if you're just using jQuery, it's easy to just locally munge and access data. But the wins that we've been able to get through the ecosystem by separating this into a separate layer have really shown themselves. Especially, like, it's kind of amazing that Fastboot, like if you're using jQuery Ajax, other than monkey patching jQuery and hoping for the best, it really would be impossible to have a straightforward way to install Fastboot and have all your network requests work properly. And that today just works with Ember Data. And we've also embraced the consistency. We've pushed forward towards apps that have persistent APIs that basically do not, we've made modifying the serializer payloads annoying on the client side, which has led people to make their backend APIs much more consistent. And if you end up using one of the consistent, if your API is pretty consistent, for example, if you have active model serializer and use Rails, because we have pushed for that consistency, you're now able to just Ember install and npm install a library, and things will just work, and you don't even have to configure your app whatsoever. And we pushed forward with JSON API as that standard format. And we have gotten that to work as well. And now if you have a JSON API backend and you have a JSON API, and you have an Ember and an Ember Data app, things just work. You're able to install your backend, install your front end, and do a minimal amount of configuration and work and get this done. And this is, if you remember how 2011 looked, I think this is quite an amazing achievement, especially because we got all the people in an ecosystem to do this. I think you could have a standard system that would just do this by itself, but it wouldn't really be possible at all to get a bunch of people to standardize an ecosystem like this. So I think one bet that paid off is this layer isolation. The other one is we have an identity map, and that really, well, I have other people who are able to say this better than I am. I was working on my talk a couple of days ago, and I saw this tweet, and I was like, this is amazing. And this is exactly why we pushed for an identity map as one of the core primitives in Ember Data. And that's because having a caching layer in memory in the app is extremely powerful. And I just want to thank Sam for doing this. This made my talk. I had like 3 slides. I can just point to what he said, and you can trust him because he is on a podcast. And we've also worked on relationship persistency, and you're able to now have foreign keys that point to each other, and you know that if you have 2 different users and they have a belongs to relationships between them, you know that your data is going to be consistent. Having this on the client side is really quite impressive. And if you remember, Rails for a very long time didn't even have foreign key constraints. It pretended it did, and if you didn't really screw up your data, it worked. But for the longest time, until like maybe 5 years ago or 4 years ago, they didn't even put, like, the SQL was there. The foreign key constraints were just not created. So we've been able to create a productive conventional system that if we look at the app that Sam talks about, the Ember add-on docs, the amount of code in this app that deals with the model layer is very small. Like, if you actually download this app and look at it, there'll be a couple of model definitions that are extremely straightforward. There's going to be one serializer hook, and that's going to be pretty much it. Everything else is based on our ecosystem and our conventions and the things we have built. So we started in 2011, and if today was 2015, I'd be done. I'd be like, we did an amazing job. I'm done here. I'll go back. I'll go find a beach and hang out with DHH or like race cars or something. And I might say, oh, OK, so look, there's this whole Artane thing. Our classes look nicer, and you don't need run loops in tests. And we've done all these things to make things nicer. And here's some tactical improvements. Maybe there's a better support, or relationships work better, and so on. But the problem with Ember, and I think that's really quite annoying about it, to be honest, is that our tagline is, we are a framework for ambitious web developers. And this is deeply annoying to me, because ambitious is a relative term. And you're never done. And if this was 2015, we would be done and we would have a first-in-class system. But the problem is, our ambitions, as our tools have scaled, so have our ambitions. And the things that we're trying to do today are much harder and would have been impossible back in 2012. So let's, and not only that, not only the things we want to do today, I want to also, hopefully this is going to happen next year and the year after, and we'll probably see each other in 2025, for example. And I want to talk about like how can we get from where we are today and the things we have built so far into the future. And I think there are a couple of key points here. One is larger scale and higher performance. Tom actually gave a talk at EmberConf Chicago that I think should be online pretty soon that talked about how our ambitions for deploying our apps and accessing many more users as they come online in countries where a typical phone probably costs $90 and has like an extremely bad JavaScript rendering engine, how a current Ember app, and especially an Ember app from a couple of years ago, not only would it not work well there, it wasn't even a design constraint. It wasn't really a thing we optimized for. And optimizing for data and network performance is really something that we, in order to access all the people that use the apps we use today, we need to optimize for that. And I really want to point you, as soon as this talk comes online, Tom's as funny as always, and it's actually a deeply engaging talk about how we can bring Ember's performance to a level where you can deploy to a phone that's like costs $50 somewhere in India, and it actually works well and has all the necessary features to make that accessible. And I think also the other part is the web and the web platform and the community have made a lot of progress in the parts that we have not pushed as hard at as the parts that we have. And advanced data fetching, caching, and mutations have become, and are currently becoming much, much more common in the JavaScript space. And GraphQL and things like Falcor and Relay have really paved the path there. And we have some work to do to catch up to make the Ember experience as consistent and as nice as it can be. Dan gave a talk about the library he maintains, Orbit, that really experiments with a lot of these features and has been a huge help to us on the Ember Data core team. The way I think about Dan's role on the core team is, if you ever, I don't know if you have a friend or a mentor who has done a lot of things and has done the things you're trying to do and tries to give you advice, but because you're too hard-headed, you don't listen. Like, they try to get you to change your chair, so because like if you keep sitting in a chair for 5 years, at some point you'll develop back pains, and then you'll be very, very sad. I think of Dan's role on the Ember Data core team, something analogous to that, of having done a lot of work to experiment with all the advanced features and capabilities, and then coming back to us and telling us, maybe you shouldn't do that, and maybe you should do this. And us saying, well, thank you for your input. We'll consider it. And then we inevitably come back 3 to 6 months later and are like, you know what? I guess you were right. Seems like you have also thought about this. And the other third part that we also really need to work on and make better is the developer experience and developer visibility into what happens in Ember Data. Because while we have a really decent surface area, we have not exposed the internals as much as we need to for the average developer to understand what is going on. So let's go back to this app that Sam talked about. And let's look at why it's the app Sam talked about is a great match for Ember Data, because it doesn't really need to work on really cheap phones, and also isn't in extremely large scale. And when I say very large scale, I mean it has at most, actually it has 4 models, but it has at most hundreds of models and has basically a few developers working on it. And that works really well. And for us has been really the sweet spot. We have gotten the CRUD apps, we have gotten the apps that have reasonable data fetching to work. Because we had a lot of advantage. We started in 2011. But we also have the curse of being too early. This is basically the worst Pirates of the Caribbean movie I've seen. And we also have the curse of a very large standard library because we were so early and we developed so many things. And the problem we have right now is we have worked on this for 8 years. We have a monolithic library that we've worked on for so long that the surface area is extremely large. And the internal architecture is very convoluted and interdependent. So we need to fix this in order to launch all of the new features and all the things I just talked about. Because I've just identified all the problems we have. And as we know, identifying the problems is the hardest step. So given that I've done that, it should be pretty easy to just go and fix them. But we need a strategy for fixing this. And I have basically an approach that I want to talk to you about. And this is my standard, one of my productivity traits that has followed me throughout my career. I think maybe a couple of my managers might be in the audience, so I just have to do like a Jedi wave thing and say, please just ignore the next couple of slides I'm going to talk about. But I've learned this from like an optimization comment on Stack Overflow a long time ago. Not this one, but one quite similar like this, that said basically that not doing work, oh, that's quite small. Not doing work beats doing work every time. So whenever I can, I try to not do the work and then hope somebody else does it. Because I think that is just right, from my personal time standpoint, it's way more efficient. And luckily, we have a room full of people. So we have basically tried to expose add-ons and rely on add-ons to experiment and be that path forward in the space that creates an experimentation layer that we can then go and roll back into Ember Data. And I want to showcase very quickly a couple of add-ons that do this. One is called Ember M3, the Metamorphic model, and it deals with problems of scale. We use it at LinkedIn because we have a very, very large number of models. And currently, Ember Data defines models in classes, which is really quite inconvenient. It kind of works nice, and it scales up to some point. But the problem is it conflates two different parts of defining a model. It gives you the schema information, and it defines what the attribute and relationships are. And it also defines the class and the object that you get from a find. It tells you, you basically are defining the class that you get back. And that's fine, and that works up to some point, because each of these classes has to be parsed and executed by your JavaScript engine for no matter how inconsequential or small that part of the payload is. So you basically need to have one class per type, which is fine up to some point. And so that works when you have one model and one type and 100 models and 100 types. But if you get into thousands and thousands of model definitions, that doesn't really scale. And if you think about this not being a realistic use case, think just about having a complicated nested payload. For example, if you use something that looks like GraphQL, or you had a different, just a very optimized JSON payload that had nested structures, you would use TS model fragments today, and that would work. But it would require you to have a model for every single nested part. So even just this payload would have 1, 2, 3, 4 models. And if you think about having custom payloads for every different page that's optimized to work on mobile on like a very small device, you want to optimize all the payloads. You would, on a very simple app, you would get into hundreds of models and thousands of classes with our current setup. So, and sometimes the schema might not even be necessary, or it could be provided in the API. And it seems extremely frustrating and annoying that if your API provides you the schema, you also have to create a bunch of JavaScript classes that also do that. So Stefan Penner and David Hamilton came up with the Ember Metamorphic model. And that's an Ember Data add-on that basically creates a single model class that all of your models use and separates schema and class information. So all the models have the same backing class. And the wins that we've seen performance-wise have been extremely high. The problem is that your app kind of doesn't have any models, which is a trade-off if you're used to the current Ember data system, which is very object-oriented and gives you model classes. So while I recommend using this, if you have these problems, I think using this add-on is extremely useful, and it will make your life much, much easier by having a dynamic schema and also arbitrarily nested models. We will basically try to pull these ideas and changes into Ember Data proper and move to a system where schema and DS models are optional. If you want to define a model, that's fine. But if you don't, by default, your app will just be faster and nicer. So that's performance at scale. I'm almost out of time. So the other add-on I want to talk to you about is Ember Storefront, by Sam Salikov and Ryan Toronto of Ember Map. They deal with common data loading pattern problems. Of our Ember Data's APIs today have been created, basically have been unchanged since promises were introduced in JavaScript, if you remember when that was. And that was a very long time ago. So all of the basic find methods currently work, but they're not really optimized for a world in which a bunch of your requests are customized, or they have a bunch of includes or different queries. So with Ember Storefront, their documentation is great, also works offline and on a plane. But it basically gives you a default set of methods where things that you today have to do with Ember Data, like if you try to do a find all almost works exactly like it should in most of your cases, except in a couple where if you locally create a record, find all will think you have records, so it will return them to you. And then you'll also have to fetch records from scratch. And you basically end up with writing not super conventional looking and not super nice code. And with Storefront, you end up with much nicer model hooks. And you end up, instead of falling off a cliff of edge cases, you end up falling into a pit of success. And it also provides query caching, which Ember Metamorphic model also does. And this is a common theme, I think, that a bunch of different add-ons are trying to implement things. And there's quite very many, are trying to basically solve all the problems we are attacking right now. And Dan also talked about working on Orbit, and we've written a spike of Ember Data that works with Orbit. So today's 2019. We have worked on these add-ons. We got people to do free work for us. Thank you. It's very appreciated. So how do we pull this back? Where do we go from here? How do we just have a React-like ecosystem with a bunch of different add-ons that each implements a common subset of functionality? I think I highly recommend Dan's talk from last year's EmberConf that talked about some of these ideas that we've now started to implement in Ember Data. But basically, given that we have the curse of the large standard library, and we also have a curse of being a very monolithic library, we are basically now in a point where we need to do something to make these add-ons coexist and work together. So what we have done is we have spent a bunch of work, because currently all of these add-ons work really well, except if you look at their source code. If you look at their source code, it's, well, good luck, but it's really quite gnarly, because they have to use a bunch of internal APIs of our monolithic stack. And they have to do a bunch of things, and you'll see things they'll have to access things like .internal model, and internal's in the name. Like it can't get, we could put more underscores, but it can't get worse than that. And I think it's mostly our fault. I think the add-on authors have done a tremendous job, and I couldn't think of a better way they could have done it. But the current situation is, if you look at Ember model fragments, this is their support matrix for a version match, because they had to subclass and monkey patch and use a bunch of our internal APIs. So we currently have hard to develop add-ons that are hard to integrate into core, and also make working, like we also want to create add-ons to experiment and test things out before we bake them into the library. It becomes much, much harder for us to work. I took a bit of a break from Ember, and I came back, and I looked at the things I was trying to do. I was like, oh my God, I should reconsider my life choices, maybe. But we've spent a bunch of work this year creating a nicer and working on a design for a much nicer Ember Data ecosystem for add-on developers. And I think that's extremely important, because that's one of the biggest values and the biggest advantages that we have as Ember, is that every Ember developer is a potential add-on author. And we need to make this on-ramp much faster and much better and much smoother. So ending up in 2019, other than most Game of Thrones characters being dead, we are aiming to make all of the Ember Data add-ons use no private APIs, and to make that experience much smoother so we can bring it back in. And we have done a bunch of design work. There are a bunch of RFCs out there. Some of them are in a final comment period. Some are not. I have no time to go through any of them. But we have put quite a bit of work into them. Please read them, comment. I'll be here all day. Come talk to me, harass me, and complain about Ember Data. So in conclusion, we are working really, really hard on this. This year, we had a couple of team members alumnize themselves and move on with their careers. We also had a couple of new team members join. Chris Tober and Robert Jackson have joined the team full-time and officially, which seems kind of like a wash. If you look at the team, we lost 2 people, we gained 2 people. But if you've ever worked with Robert Jackson, you know that the reality of the situation is more like this. So if you do want to help out or want to make Ember Data's add-on ecosystem better, we are recruiting. So please come join us in Discord or talk to me or follow me on Twitter and harass me there. Thank you. I hope I did not go too much over time. Thank you very much.